On his first day in office, Donald Trump signed a high-profile memorandum on the America First trade policy. The memo directed his cabinet to assess the feasibility of revoking China's permanent normal trade relations (PNTR) status, with a deadline set for April 1st. This move was seen as a potential nuclear option in the Trump administration's trade policy towards China. On January 23rd, Congress swiftly introduced the Restoring Trade Fairness Act, which calls for the permanent revocation of China's PNTR status. The bill proposes phased tariffs on Chinese goods, starting at 100% for strategic materials like semiconductors and rare earths, with planned increases over the next 5 years. The legislation also eliminates the duty-free allowance for imported goods under $800, effectively blocking low-threshold cross-border e-commerce channels that allow Chinese goods to enter the U.S. market. Lawmakers explained that tariff revenues would be used to subsidize American farmers impacted by potential Chinese retaliatory measures. These funds would also bolster the procurement of critical materials needed for national security, addressing risks associated with supply chain disruptions and geopolitical conflicts. To understand PNTR, we must look back to 1979, when the U.S. and China established diplomatic relations. The following year, the two nations signed the U.S.-China Trade Relations Agreement, granting each other Most Favored Nation status, MFN. This ensured that trade terms between the two countries were no less favorable than those offered to any other nation. However, under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of 1974, the U.S. was required to annually review trade relations with non-market economies, including China and the Soviet Union. As a result, China's MFN status was subject to yearly reviews. In July 1998, President Bill Clinton signed a tax reform bill that changed the term Most Favored Nation to normal trade relations. On May 17, 2000, a major development occurred on Capitol Hill. The House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee voted to grant China Permanent Normal Trade Relations status, PNTR. Shortly after, on May 24th and September 19th, the House and Senate formally passed the bill, solidifying PNTR as law. This marked a significant moment in history. At the time, the logic behind the decision was straightforward. Allowing China to join the World Trade Organization would connect its 1.4 billion people to the global market. This would open opportunities for U.S. businesses to enter China and achieve significant growth. Many policymakers also believed that as China's economy grew, its political system would become more open. Trade was seen as a bridge to integrate China into globalization and encourage systemic changes. Over 2 decades later, the outcome has been very different. President Donald Trump frequently stated at campaign rallies, "China stole our jobs," a sentiment that resonated with many Americans. The trade imbalance between the two nations supports these concerns. The U.S. trade deficit with China rose from approximately $83 billion in 2001 to $383 billion in 2022. This imbalance contributed to economic decline in America's Rust Belt. Detroit, once known as the automotive capital of the world, has become one of the poorest cities in the country due to manufacturing job losses and reduced competitiveness. Pittsburgh's steel industry also suffered from the influx of cheap Chinese imports. By 2010, employment in the U.S. steel industry had dropped from over 600,000 jobs in the 1970s to fewer than 150,000. North Carolina, which once thrived with textile factories, also saw 600 mills close between 2000 and 2010. In Shenzhen and Dongguan, China absorbed a large portion of global electronics production, including the core supply chain for iPhones. Apple's reliance on Chinese manufacturing includes major Foxconn facilities in Shenzhen and Zhengzhou. This shift has left the U.S. without control over electronic component production and increasingly dependent on critical supply chains overseas. Solar panel production is another significant example. In the 1990s, the U.S. dominated the global solar panel market. Today, over 90% of solar panels are manufactured in China. Research from the Boston Consulting Group highlights that this shift has diminished the U.S.'s influence in renewable energy technologies. From steel and textiles to electronics and renewable energy, the transfer of supply chains from the U.S. to China has led to substantial deindustrialization in America. Meanwhile, China has aggressively expanded its global trade presence through extensive subsidies and policy supports. Intellectual property and technology transfer issues have further intensified tensions. General Electric, for example, face demands to partner with Chinese state-owned enterprises and share key technology while working on gas turbine projects. Although GE avoided sharing core secrets, it made concessions on critical technologies, which were later used in Chinese naval vessels. European companies like Siemens faced similar pressures, with U.S. firms often bearing the brunt. In 2018, U.S. semiconductor company Micron Technology accused China's Fujian Integrated Circuit Company of stealing trade secrets and producing competing products. However, in Chinese courts, Micron lost the case and was countersued, leading to a temporary sales ban on some of its products in China. The prolonged dispute significantly weakened Micron's competitiveness in the Chinese market. The rise of Huawei and ZTE has also drawn criticism. Many U.S. analysts attribute their success to reverse engineering, imitation, and government subsidies. Huawei, for instance, was accused of copying Cisco equipment in its early years. In 2003, Cisco filed a lawsuit against Huawei, which was later settled without significant consequences. Similar practices have allowed Chinese companies to gain a foothold in advanced fields like 5G technology. U.S. technology companies often face challenges exporting to China. Boeing, for instance, reported strong demand for its aircraft in China, but encountered frequent safety inspections imposed by the Chinese government. These inspections pressured Boeing into making concessions on technology transfers, local investments, or market access conditions. Similar obstacles have been reported in the medical equipment sector. American manufacturers of advanced diagnostic imaging devices have struggled to get their products approved in China, often losing market share to local competitors. These challenges have fueled backlash in U.S. political circles. According to the Wall Street Journal, intellectual property theft costs the U.S. economy between $225 billion and $600 billion annually, with a significant portion linked to China. China's actions, such as building artificial islands in the South China Sea and expanding its Belt and Road Initiative, have reinforced U.S. efforts to counter the Chinese government on multiple fronts. Revoking China's trade privileges, such as the most favored nation status, is seen as a way to restrict its access to the U.S. market and curb economic growth through higher tariffs. The roots of these measures date back to 2019, when U.S. lawmakers frequently questioned how China's GDP had grown from approximately $1.2 trillion in 2000 to nearly $14 trillion by 2019, a nearly 11-fold increase. After taking office in 2021, President Joe Biden continued the tough stance on China initiated by former President Trump. Lawmakers in both the House and Senate introduced various bills aimed at limiting China's economic and strategic development. On January 10, 2023, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution to establish a special committee focused on China. Named the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, its mission is to assess economic and strategic threats posed by China and develop comprehensive countermeasures. On March 27th, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed the PRC is not a developing country act with a vote of 415 to 0. This legislation mandates the administration to advocate for removing China's designation as a developing country. Lawmakers who introduced the bill argued that China, as the world's second-largest economy with extensive manufacturing and export capabilities, should no longer receive preferential treatment under World Trade Organization rules. These include delayed market access, state subsidies, and exemptions from technology transfer requirements, which they consider unfair. On November 14, 2024, Congressman John Molinar, chair of the Select Committee on the CCP, proposed the Restoring Trade Fairness Act. This proposal served as the foundation for a bipartisan bill introduced on January 23 this year. The latest version of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act includes a phased tariff system. It begins with an additional 10% tariff on Chinese imports in the first year, increasing to 25% in the second year, 50% in the fourth year, and 100% by the fifth year. The bill differentiates between non-strategic goods and strategic materials. Non-strategic goods, such as consumer electronics, household appliances, and everyday items, would face a minimum tariff of 35% within a few years. Strategic strategic materials, including 5G equipment, aviation parts, and semiconductor wafers, would start with a 100% tariff, effectively eliminating Chinese companies' competitiveness in the U.S. market. In response, Beijing issued a strong statement. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs urged the U.S. to pull back from the brink, while the Ministry of Commerce warned of reciprocal retaliation and emphasized that such measures would only lead to higher costs for American consumers. Over recent years, China has repeatedly taken a hardline stance in trade disputes, refusing to negotiate or make concessions. However, in practice, it has made some adjustments, such as purchasing American agricultural products and opening parts of its financial sector. If the U.S. were to revoke PNTR, it is unclear whether China would make similar concessions to ease tensions. Analysts suggest this would be increasingly difficult. There's speculation that China might retaliate against American companies operating within its borders or restrict rare earth exports. However, experts note that the global rare earth supply is not solely dependent on China. Countries like the U.S. and Australia have potential to increase production, and the international market could quickly adapt. As for sanctions on American firms in China, foreign businesses have been leaving the Chinese market in significant numbers. In November 2023, Vanguard Group and Gallup announced that they were closing their operations in China. Earlier in the year, software giant Teradata exited the Chinese market, joining companies like Adobe, Tableau, Salesforce, Oracle, and Nutanix, which had already withdrawn. The departure of foreign businesses has led to lost orders, reduced technology transfers, and fewer job opportunities in China. Apple, for instance, is shifting parts of its production lines to India and Vietnam, reducing China's role in the global supply chain. This exodus could further decrease China's export revenue and foreign trade reserves while weakening its capacity for innovation. If the U.S. implements high tariffs, how will other advanced economies like the EU, Japan, Canada, and Australia respond? During the 2018 trade war initiated by the first Trump administration, the EU sometimes disagreed with unilateral U.S. actions, but they shared concerns about China's industrial subsidies and technology transfer policies. Recently, the EU introduced mechanisms for anti-subsidy investigations and is considering additional reviews for imports from non-market economies. In sectors like 5G, solar panels, and electric vehicles, the EU has begun compliance reviews of Chinese firms. Japan has tightened investment restrictions in China and is cooperating with the U.S. on supply chain relocation. Countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico are capitalizing on this shift, attracting industries moving out of China. Companies such as Apple, HP, and Dell are reducing their reliance on Chinese manufacturing, while many small European businesses are exiting the Chinese market due to geopolitical risks and regulatory uncertainties. Further tariff measures from the U.S. could accelerate this trend. If China seeks closer ties with Russia, the geopolitical and energy complementarities may remain limited. European allies are unlikely to overlook such moves, further isolating China. Meanwhile, multinational companies may face reduced orders or hasten capacity relocation, causing disruptions in the global economy. Some have questioned whether high U.S. tariffs on China will burden American consumers. Many goods at retailers like Walmart are sourced from China, and increased tariffs could raise prices. During the first wave of tariffs under the Trump administration, studies showed some cost increases for American consumers. However, inflation in the U.S. has not been driven solely by tariffs. Factors like pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and monetary policy have played larger roles. For example, a 60% tariff on toys imported from China might raise production costs from $1 to $1.6 US. However, the retail price might only increase from $10 to $10.6 US. For middle-income Americans, such price changes are unlikely to cause significant hardship. The United States has ample fiscal and monetary tools to counter inflation and can continue seeking alternative suppliers in Latin America and Southeast Asia. Polls indicate that public support for a tough stance on China has grown steadily in recent years. Many Americans are willing to pay slightly more for certain goods to protect domestic jobs and prevent technology leaks. In the political climate of elections, criticizing China often wins votes, while advocating for new trade agreements with Beijing might be seen as giving in to authoritarianism. As a result, despite potential concerns, capital markets, lawmakers are generally willing to take on some inflation risk to leverage the China card. Public opinion, already shaped by anti-China sentiment, continues to drive this shift. If domestic U.S. policies on China remain increasingly hardline, further measures such as high tariffs, diplomatic freezes, and investment restrictions are likely. For the Chinese government, the choice might appear straightforward: either soften its stance or hold firm. However, the reality is far more complex. If Beijing resists and takes risks, such as targeting U.S. businesses or U.S. Treasury holdings, it would incur significant costs. These could increase a mass exodus of foreign companies, a collapse in confidence in the yuan, and increased pressure on the financial system. Large-scale capital flight could put China's economy in a far more precarious position. On the other hand, making concessions to the U.S., such as opening more markets and reducing subsidies and protections for state-owned enterprises, would challenge the CCP's core interests. This could undermine its control over the domestic economy. China's leadership has already set its tone in political propaganda, emphasizing adherence to the party's leadership. Making significant concessions again could create internal contradictions, as the party system prioritizes stability and is more likely to use external pressure as a unifying domestic narrative rather than driving internal reform. China has attempted to counterbalance U.S. containment efforts by strengthening ties with the EU, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN countries. However, these potential partners remain skeptical of China's model. Japan and South Korea are focusing on supply chain security, while German businesses are reevaluating the risks of operating in China. A key question is whether a China-Russia-Iran axis in military and energy cooperation will form under U.S. pressure. Such an alliance could challenge the U.S.-led international order on another level. However, it remains uncertain whether this new alignment could compensate for the economic losses China would face from reduced access to the U.S. market. Russia's resources have been heavily drained by the conflict in Ukraine, and Iran's role in global finance is marginal. Neither can replace the comprehensive strength of the U.S. and Western markets. Reflecting on the year 2000, when the U.S. Congress passed PNTR with fanfare, President Bill Clinton confidently proclaimed that integrating China into the world will make everyone better off. Now, 2 decades later, that optimism has given way to a cold confrontation reminiscent of a new Cold War. Can the U.S. and China still sit down for constructive dialogue? With tensions escalating, this seems unlikely in the near term. For China, losing PNTR could mark the beginning of broader economic decline. For the U.S., it represents a radical gamble with significant economic costs. Yet, driven by disillusionment and fear of Beijing, American society appears willing to take this risk, even if it means higher costs for consumers. In the coming years, calls to expel China from the WTO may grow louder, or the U.S. could bypass the WTO entirely, creating a new multilateral trade framework with its allies to isolate China. If this happens, global conflicts over the economic order are likely to intensify. Regardless of the outcome, the moment President Trump signed his executive order on day 1 set the stage for a showdown. The issue is no longer just about tariffs, but about who will dominate the global order, China or the United States. The critical question now is whether China will adjust to address its past commitments or further close itself off, framing U.S. actions as an external threat in an effort to increase domestic trade cycles. The world is watching closely, knowing that either path will unleash significant upheaval. The cancellation of China's most favored nation status is just the first spark in what could become a far-reaching explosion.